What if Antarctica is hiding Earth's real history? There is a place on Earth that is, in a way, not on Earth at all. A continent the size of the United States and Mexico combined, yet it holds no countries, no cities, and almost no permanent residents. It is the driest, coldest, and highest desert in the world. A landscape of white silence, governed by a cold so profound it feels less like a temperature and more like a law of physics. This is Antarctica. For most of our history it was just a rumour, a ghost on the edge of the map called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Today we have mapped its surface, but what lies beneath remains the planet's last great locked room. The key to this room is not metal, but time, and the door is 2 miles thick. 2 miles of solid ice, a weight so immense it has pressed the continent itself deeper into the Earth's crust. But ice does more than just crush, it preserves. In its layers, scientists read the planet's climate history like the rings of a tree. In its frozen core, they find air from 100,000 years ago. Ice is the ultimate archive. It is a time capsule on a planetary scale, and this simple, physical fact forces us to ask a difficult, almost forbidden question. If this ice sheet can perfectly preserve a bubble of ancient air, what else might it be preserving? We have a story we tell ourselves about our own beginning. It's a story that starts, we believe, in the warm river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus. A story of agriculture, of the first cities, of writing. It's a good story, a familiar one. It begins roughly 6,000 years ago, but the modern human mind, a mind capable of abstract thought, of art, of myth, has been around for at least 50,000 years. Some would argue much longer. That leaves a vast, dark ocean of time in our own history, a gap of tens of thousands of years. We call it quote zero, which is a polite way of saying quote one. What if we've been looking in the wrong places? What if the story doesn't begin in the sands of the Middle East, but in a world that no longer exists? What if the first chapter of the human story, the one we've never read, the one we don't even know is missing, is filed away in that final frozen archive? This isn't a question about aliens or magic. It's a question about human memory. A question of a possible continent-sized amnesia. What if, beneath the ice of Antarctica, lies the echo of a civilization that was lost to the world so completely, we forgot it was ever there? This is the central question of our investigation, and to answer it, we have to be willing to look at the map of our world and of our past and ask, is it complete? But this question is a dangerous one. It leads down a rabbit hole of speculation, of wild theories, but also of genuine scientific anomalies and historical artifacts that don't quite fit. It's a landscape where serious inquiry and outright fantasy can look disturbingly similar. So before we take our first step into that landscape, a quick promise. This is not a journey into belief. This is an investigation into a question. We will separate what is known from what is merely claimed. We will examine the hard evidence, the uncomfortable counter-arguments, and the vast silent gaps in between. The goal here isn't to sell you an answer. It's to understand why this question about a lost history in Antarctica is so powerful, and why it refuses to go away. An investigation like this takes a long time to piece together. So, before we properly begin, a small request. If you value this kind of deep dive content, supporting the video with a like is the single best way to help us continue making it. And if you want to join us for future investigations, subscribing is the way to ensure you don't miss them. And one more thing, in the comments just let us know what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to get a sense of our global team assembling for these journeys from different corners of the world across all the different time zones. Alright, we're ready. To understand what might be hidden under the ice, we can't start with ancient maps or whispered myths. That comes later. We have to start with the ice itself, with the ground truth. We need to understand the stage upon which this immense historical drama might have played out. Because millions of years ago, that stage looked nothing like it does today. To begin this investigation, we have to start with a fact so counterintuitive, so completely at odds with every image of Antarctica we hold in our minds, that it almost sounds like science fiction. But it isn't. The white desert at the bottom of the world was not always white, and it was not always a desert. For millions of years, Antarctica was green. This is not a guess. This is a geological certainty. Scientists drilling deep into the sediment off its coasts and into the rock beneath the ice have found indisputable proof. They've uncovered the fossilized remains of ancient beech forests, the pollen of palm trees, the spores of ferns. They've found evidence of a world with a temperate subtropical climate, crisscrossed by winding rivers and inhabited by dinosaurs and early mammals. A world that was, for a vast stretch of Earth's history, teeming with life. For a long time, this was a somewhat abstract picture, a story told by microscopic fossils. But in recent years, our technology has allowed us to see this lost world with stunning clarity. Using ice-penetrating radar and satellite data, teams of scientists have mapped a vast, previously unknown landscape hidden beneath more than 2 miles of ice. And what they found, published in just the last couple of years, is staggering. A complete, perfectly preserved river landscape, the size of a country like Belgium, locked in time. It shows ancient valleys, rolling hills, and the clear channels of 3 major rivers that once flowed towards the sea. This isn't a reconstruction or a theory. It's a ghost map of a world that hasn't seen the sun for, according to the researchers, at least 34 million years. So, let that sink in. Beneath the most hostile environment on Earth lies a pristine, temperate landscape, flash-frozen and untouched by erosion for an almost unimaginable length of time. We are looking at a snapshot of a different planet that happens to occupy the same space as our own. We have now established the first pillar of our investigation, a lost continent, a potential paradise, a world that could have easily supported life. The foundation for our central question is solid. But the most important question isn't if this world existed. The question is when. And the answer to that is where this investigation gets complicated. So, we have a scientifically established fact. A green, habitable continent at the South Pole. This opens the door to our central question. If there was a world there, could there have been a civilization? And if so, when? The answer to that question is where this investigation hits a wall. A wall of ice, certainly, but more importantly, a wall of time. According to the geological record, Antarctica's long summer didn't end a few thousand years ago. It ended around 34 million years ago. This wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, grinding process. The continent, once connected to South America and Australia, drifted fully into its polar position. This opened up the Drake Passage, allowing a new frigid ocean current to encircle the continent, isolating it in a thermal prison. Global carbon dioxide levels fell. Slowly, inexorably, the ice began to grow, first on the high mountain ranges, then spreading outwards, until the forests and rivers of that lost world were buried under a permanent sheet of ice miles thick. Now, let's place our own species on that same timeline. The earliest fossils of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, are about 300,000 years old. Our most distant ape-like ancestors, the Australopithecines, walked the Earth maybe 4 million years ago. 34 million, 4 million, 300,000. The numbers don't just fail to overlap, they exist in different universes of time. To put this into perspective, imagine the entire history of Earth condensed into a single 24-hour day. The dinosaurs would vanish around 1:40 a.m. The green, temperate Antarctica would be gone by the early morning. All of recorded human history, the pyramids, Rome, the internet, would take place in the last fraction of the last second before midnight. The civilization we are looking for would have had to exist and vanish long before the first hint of humanity appeared anywhere on the planet. This is the central brutal challenge to the entire hypothesis. It's a chasm in time so vast that it makes the distance between us and the Roman Empire feel like a lunch break. We can call it the 34 million year problem. Any theory about a lost human civilization in Antarctica must, before anything else, provide a credible answer to this. It's not enough to say there are strange maps or myths. You first have to explain how human beings could have been on a continent that became uninhabitable more than 30 million years before they evolved. So how do proponents of this lost civilization answer this? They don't. Instead, they argue that the geological clock is wrong. They argue that the freeze was not ancient and slow, but recent and catastrophic. And to make that case, they turn from geology to 2 very different kinds of evidence: an old, impossible map and a radical theory about how the world itself can break. This 34 million year gap is, for mainstream science, where the investigation comes to a halt. It's a chronological chasm so vast that it separates the world of ancient temperate Antarctica from the world of human beings completely. The case, from this perspective, is closed. A human civilization couldn't have existed on a continent that froze over 30 million years before the first human ancestor walked the Earth. But for a small and persistent group of writers and independent researchers, this isn't a closed case, it's a false premise. They argue that the established timeline is not wrong, but incomplete. Their solution to the 34 million year problem is to propose that the long winter ended, that Antarctica, against all geological odds, became temperate and habitable again, and much, much more recently. The time frame this theory proposes is radical. Not millions of years ago, but thousands. The argument is that during the last Great Ice Age, which ended roughly 12,000 years ago, Antarctica was not entirely covered in ice. At least parts of it, according to this narrative, were temperate, green, and capable of supporting complex life. This would place a habitable Antarctica directly within the timeline of anatomically modern humans, a world where our ancestors could have walked on green Antarctic shores while woolly mammoths still roamed Siberia. For a temperate continent at the pole to become the ice cap we see today, gradual change isn't an option. The geological record shows no slow, creeping glaciation at that time. Therefore, the narrative requires a different mechanism. It requires a cataclysm, a sudden, violent, world-altering event that didn't just cool the continent but flash-froze it. An event so swift and total that it could entomb an entire ecosystem, and perhaps an entire civilization, before it had time to flee or decay. So, the hypothesis takes its full shape. It posits a lost mother civilization, flourishing on the shores of a temperate Antarctica during the Ice Age. Then, in a geological instant, the world is turned upside down. The planet's crust shifts, or a celestial object strikes, or some other force of unimaginable power plunges the continent into an instant, permanent deep freeze. This catastrophe didn't just wipe the civilization off the map, it sealed it under the map, preserving its secrets beneath 2 miles of ice. It's an extraordinary claim, and for it to be taken seriously, it needs extraordinary evidence. For many, that evidence begins not with geology or ice cores, but with cartography, with a map that, by all accounts, should not exist. To make a claim as radical as this, that a lost civilization flourished in a more temperate past, and was then flash-frozen by a cataclysm, you need more than a theory, you need evidence, something tangible. An artifact that doesn't fit the official story. For proponents of this idea, that artifact is not a myth. It is a real object, sitting today in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. The story begins in 1929. During a renovation of the palace library, a dusty bundle of old maps was rediscovered. Among them was a fragment, drawn on gazelle skin parchment, signed by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. The map is dated to the year 1513. For decades, it was regarded as a historical curiosity, a beautifully crafted but imperfect map of the known world, showing the coasts of Europe, North Africa, and the newly discovered shores of Brazil with remarkable accuracy for its time. But it's the bottom edge of the map that turns it from a historical document into Exhibit A in a mystery. It shows a coastline that continues eastward from the southern tip of South America. For centuries, this was assumed to be an error, or perhaps a fanciful depiction of the mythical great southern continent Terra Australis. The problem is that landmass on the map doesn't look like a fantasy. It looks specific. It has bays, inlets, and islands. This detail remained a puzzle until the mid-20th century, when modern science gave us a new way to see our own planet. Using seismic sounding and ground-penetrating radar, researchers began to map the actual landmass of Antarctica, buried beneath 2 miles of ice. And when they mapped the coast of one particular region, Queen Maud Land, a strange and unsettling correspondence emerged. According to some researchers, the coastline drawn by Piri Reis in 1513 bears an uncanny resemblance to the subglacial coast of Antarctica. The map appears to show rivers flowing from mountains, details that have been hidden under the ice sheet for, at the very least, thousands of years. The implication is staggering. Piri Reis himself noted on the map that he compiled it from around 20 older source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. But no one in the ancient world, let alone the 16th century, could have possibly known the topography of Antarctica beneath the ice. The only way this information could exist, the argument goes, is if someone mapped it before the ice was there. A civilization with sophisticated knowledge of geography and cartography operating in a remote antiquity that our history books have no record of. This idea might seem like pure speculation, but it gained a strange dose of credibility in 1960. A professor of history named Charles Hapgood, the main proponent of this theory, sent his findings to the United States Air Force. The reply he received from a Lieutenant Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer, commander of a cartographic squadron, is now a foundational text for this entire field of inquiry. Ohlmeyer's letter states, and I quote 2. The letter concludes, quote 3. So here we have it, a physical artifact from 500 years ago that seems to show a land not officially discovered until the 1820s, and it shows that land without its ice cover, a condition that hasn't existed for thousands of years, and an apparent validation of this puzzle from a US Air Force cartography expert. It seems like a smoking gun. But what do professional cartographers and historians see when they look at this same piece of parchment? So, what is the answer? Is this piece of gazelle skin a message from a lost world, or is it something else entirely? For decades, the debate was largely a stalemate between mainstream historians who dismissed the map and independent researchers who saw it as proof. But in the year 2000, the investigation took a decisive turn. A historian of cartography named Gregory McIntosh published what is now considered the most thorough and definitive analysis of the map ever conducted. His book, The Piri Reis Map of 1513, meticulously compared the chart not just to modern geography, but to dozens of other Portuguese and Spanish maps from the same period. McIntosh's conclusion was clear, and it dismantled the ancient civilization theory piece by piece. The mysterious landmass at the bottom of the map, he argued, is not Antarctica at all. It is the coast of South America, specifically Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, which has been distorted and bent eastward by roughly 90 degrees. This sounds like a simple dismissal, but the evidence is compelling. First, and most critically, look at the map itself. The southern landmass is not a separate continent. It is physically attached to the known coast of South America. There is no gap, no body of water that could represent the Drake Passage, which separates the two continents. To a 16th century cartographer, this was simply where the known world continued. Second, the details on that coastline make little sense for Antarctica, but align surprisingly well with Patagonia. When McIntosh and other researchers digitally corrected the distortion, essentially rotating that bent section of coastline back into its proper north-south alignment, the features suddenly locked into place. Rivers and bays depicted by Piri Reis, which were previously a mystery, matched up with the known geography of coastal Argentina. The likely reason for this distortion is, in the end, not a world-shattering mystery. It's a practical problem that any mapmaker would understand. Piri Reis himself noted that he compiled his chart from about 20 different source maps. He was likely trying to fit a very long vertical coastline from a Portuguese source onto a horizontal piece of parchment. He simply ran out of room and turned the corner. But what about that letter from the US? Air Force, the one that seemed to confirm the map's impossible accuracy. Later analysis showed that this too was based on a misunderstanding. The comparison made in 1960 was based on a flawed projection, and more importantly, it failed to account for a basic geological principle called isostatic rebound. In simple terms, a 2-mile-thick ice sheet is so heavy it pushes the continent down into the Earth's mantle. If you were to magically remove the ice, the land would slowly rise up, creating a coastline completely different from the subglacial bedrock we've mapped today. The comparison was, effectively, apples to oranges. So, the Piri Reis map seems to have a rational, historical explanation. But this solves one mystery only to reveal a much larger one. If this specific map doesn't show an ice-free Antarctica, why did so many other maps from that era, like the famous charts of Oronce Finet or Gerardus Mercator, also depict a massive, detailed southern continent? The answer has nothing to do with lost sailors or ancient technologies. It has to do with a forgotten idea from ancient Greece, a ghost continent that haunted the minds of map makers for nearly 2,000 years. This brings our investigation to a critical point. If the analysis by McIntosh and others is correct, then the central piece of evidence for an ice-free Antarctica on a 16th century map dissolves. The coastline is a distorted South America, and the case seems closed. But this tidy explanation leaves behind a nagging question. Why draw a massive landmass at the bottom of the world at all? Piri Reis wasn't the only one. If you look at the great maps of the Renaissance, you see it again and again. A vast, mysterious continent sprawling across the South Pole. The map of Oronce-Finet from 1531 shows it. So does the famous world map of Gerardus Mercator from 1569. Were they all copying the same lost ancient source? Or were they all following a different kind of map? A map that existed not on parchment, but in the human mind. The answer begins not with ancient astronauts, but with ancient Greeks. Philosophers like Aristotle, reasoning from a principle of symmetry, argued that the world must be balanced. If the northern hemisphere had large continents, they reasoned, a massive southern landmass must exist to act as a counterweight. Otherwise, the Earth would be top-heavy and unstable. They called this hypothetical place Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. For nearly 2,000 years, this wasn't a fringe theory. It was the accepted model of the world. This idea was reinforced by a powerful psychological habit. Old map makers, it's said, subscribed to a principle called horror vacui, Latin for fear of the empty. A blank space on a map felt like a failure, an admission of ignorance, and so they filled the voids. They filled them with what they expected to find, what theory told them should be there. They drew coastlines where none had been seen, added decorative sea monsters in empty oceans, and in the great blank at the bottom of the world, they drew the continent that philosophy demanded. Viewed through this lens, the Piri Reis Map is transformed. It ceases to be a singular anomaly and becomes a perfect artifact of its time. Piri Reis wasn't a rogue agent with access to impossible knowledge. He was a master craftsman working with the best available materials. He used cutting-edge navigational charts from Portuguese sailors, and perhaps from Columbus himself, to draw the coastlines they had actually seen. And where their knowledge ended, he filled the gap, just as his contemporaries did, with the grand philosophical assumption of Terra Australis. And here, something interesting happens. The very act of these Renaissance mapmakers becomes a mirror. Their need to fill the terrifying emptiness at the bottom of the map with a story of a balanced and complete world, is perhaps the same impulse that drives us today. We look into the vast, silent emptiness of our deep past, and we too feel a kind of horror vacui. We fill that blank space with the story of a lost civilization, a forgotten golden age, to make our own history feel more complete, more balanced. So, the map doesn't point to a lost civilization in Antarctica. That seems to be the verifiable conclusion, but this doesn't mean it isn't a treasure map. In fact, what the map truly points to may be just as remarkable. Because modern analysis is uncovering evidence that Piri Reis wasn't just copying ancient theories. He was copying something very real and very recent, a now-lost map, made by Christopher Columbus himself. This brings us to the final, and perhaps most ironic, twist in the story of the Piri Reis Map. For decades, the debate has been framed as a choice between two options. Either the map is a distorted view of South America, or it's a message from a lost civilization. But what if, in our search for a mythical treasure, we've been overlooking a real one, hidden in plain sight? The answer, it turns out, was written on the map the entire time. In the margins, Piri Reis, a meticulous and scholarly admiral, listed his sources. He writes that he compiled his chart from about 20 different maps, including 8 from the time of Ptolemy, an Arab map of India, 4 contemporary Portuguese charts, and, critically, a map sourced from, in his words, __quote_5_ Christopher Columbus. Here, the investigation pivots away from lost worlds and toward a lost document. The current scholarly hypothesis is that the Piri Reis Map, while not a chart of ancient Antarctica, may be something almost as extraordinary, our only surviving copy of a lost early map drawn by Columbus himself around 1495. It may preserve his original vision of the lands he had encountered, a perspective that has otherwise vanished from history. Suddenly, the map's value transforms. It stops being a questionable piece of evidence for a fringe theory and becomes a priceless artifact of the Age of Discovery. It's a snapshot of a world in flux, seen through the eyes of an Ottoman admiral synthesizing the best intelligence of his day. It's a testament to the flow of knowledge between the Christian and Islamic worlds, and a potential window into the mind of one of history's most consequential and controversial figures. And this is the ultimate irony. For over half a century, the popular obsession with a lost civilization, a story fueled by speculation and misinterpretation, has completely overshadowed the map's genuine and arguably more fascinating secret. The search for a fantasy from our deep past may have blinded us to a real artifact from our recorded history. The treasure was there all along, we were just reading the map incorrectly. So, the map does not provide the evidence we were looking for. But that still leaves the question of the cataclysm. If a lost civilization did exist, how could it have vanished so completely, so quickly? The answer, according to the theory, lies not on the Earth's surface but deep within it. The investigation seems to have hit a dead end. If the maps of the Renaissance are not a photograph of a lost world, but a reflection of their own time, a mixture of real data, classical theory, and the human need to fill in the blanks, then where does that leave us? The most tangible piece of evidence has dissolved. But the question that started this journey hasn't gone away. It just gets louder. If a civilization did exist in a temperate past, what could have possibly erased it so completely and so quickly that it left behind only whispers and myths? The slow, grinding glaciation over millions of years doesn't fit. The narrative requires a different kind of event, a catastrophe, a single, planetary-scale trauma that could flash freeze a continent. The answer, according to one of the 20th century's most audacious thinkers, was not an event on the Earth. It was an event of the Earth itself. His name was Charles Hapgood. He wasn't a geologist, but a professor of the history of science at Keene College in New Hampshire. And in 1958 he published a book that offered a breathtakingly simple and terrifyingly radical mechanism for just such a catastrophe. The theory is called Earth crust displacement. In simple terms, imagine the Earth's outer crust, the solid ground beneath our feet, the lithosphere, not as a single, fixed shell, permanently fused to the planet's interior. Instead, imagine it as the loose peel of an orange, floating on the softer, more plastic layer beneath it, the asthenosphere. Hapgood argued that the immense weight of the polar ice caps, built up unevenly, could cause this entire peel to become unstable. Under the right conditions, it could slip, shifting the entire surface of the globe in one piece, moving continents thousands of miles in a geological blink of an eye. It is, of course, a radical idea. It seems to violate everything we assume about the slow, patient march of geology. On its own, it would be easy for a modern audience to dismiss it as pure fantasy, a relic of pre-plate tectonics thinking. Except for one detail. A detail so significant it forces us, even today, to stop and take Hapgood's work seriously. The foreword to his 1958 book, Earth-Shifting Crust, was written by Albert Einstein. Einstein wasn't a man who lent his name to trivial ideas. In his foreword he wrote, quote, quote _ 6 _ Hapgood's theory, provided the one thing the narrative needed, a kill switch. A sudden, catastrophic shift of the Earth's crust could slide an entire continent like Antarctica from a temperate latitude, similar to that of modern-day South America, directly into the Antarctic Circle, not over millions of years, but over a few thousand. The result would be precisely what the myth requires, a flash freeze, a world of forests and rivers buried under miles of ice so quickly that its civilization was wiped out, its memory almost, but not entirely erased. A radical idea, then, seemingly endorsed by the greatest scientific mind of the 20th century. It appears to solve the 34-million-year problem in one clean, dramatic stroke. It feels compelling. But what happens when we examine the mechanics of this theory, not with the physics of the 1950s, but with everything we have learned about our planet in the 70 years since? It's an elegant and terrifying idea. A single, catastrophic mechanism that explains everything. The maps, the myths, the sudden end of a forgotten world. And it carries the weight of an almost sacred name, Albert Einstein. It's easy to see why the theory of Earth crust displacement has survived for so long. It feels like it should be true. But as our investigation has shown, what feels true and what can be verified are two very different things. The key to testing Hapgood's theory isn't in ancient maps, but in the ground beneath our feet. And in the decades since he first published his work, and critically after Einstein's death, our understanding of that ground has gone through a complete revolution. That revolution is called plate tectonics. We now know, with a high degree of certainty, that the Earth's crust is not a single solid skin like the peel of an orange. It's a mosaic of enormous rigid plates, like giant pieces of a cracked eggshell, and these plates are not skating over a low-friction liquid. The mantle beneath them is solid rock, though it is hot and viscous enough to convect incredibly slowly over millions of years. Think of it less like an ocean and more like unimaginably dense, slow-moving tar. From the perspective of modern geology, this presents two fatal problems for Hapgood's theory. First, the idea of the entire crust slipping as one piece is mechanically impossible. You can't slide a cracked eggshell in a single unified motion. You would have to move each fragment individually. That's what plate tectonics describes, the slow, independent drift of separate plates, moving at the speed your fingernails grow. Second, the force required to overcome the friction and dislodge the entire lithosphere from the mantle is astronomical, far beyond anything the weight of the polar ice caps could generate. This wasn't just a conclusion of later geologists. Einstein himself, the theory's most famous supporter, saw this as a critical weakness. In his private correspondence with Hapgood, the physicist pointed out that the mechanics didn't seem to add up. He was intrigued by the concept, but he was not convinced by the engine proposed to drive it. Einstein passed away in 1955, just before the mountain of evidence for plate tectonics began to accumulate in the 1960s. We can't know for sure how he would have revised his thinking, but the scientific world he left behind was about to change completely. Hapgood's theory was a brilliant and imaginative idea in a world before that change. But in a post-plate tectonics world, it is a solution without a problem, and a mechanism without a motor. It's now considered by the geological community to be a fascinating piece of scientific history, but not a description of reality. So if a slipping crust isn't the answer, does that kill the idea of a sudden global catastrophe? Far from it. While geologists were mapping the slow dance of continents, paleoclimatologists were finding clear evidence of a different kind of shock written into the ice cores of Greenland. An event so rapid and violent, it makes Hapgood's theory look almost gentle by comparison. It's called the Younger Dryas. With Hapgood's theory dissolving under the weight of modern geology, our search for a cataclysm seems to have failed. It leaves the central hypothesis stranded. If there was a lost civilization, what could have possibly destroyed it? The maps are a dead end. The mechanism of a shifting crust doesn't hold up. And yet, this is precisely where the investigation takes its most unexpected turn. Because while the theory of a sliding crust may be fiction, the reality of a global cataclysm is not. The evidence for it just wasn't found in speculative books from the 1950s. It was found frozen in time, buried 2 miles deep inside the Greenland ice sheet. For decades, scientists have been drilling into this massive archive of ancient weather. Each layer of ice is like a page in Earth's diary, trapping air bubbles, volcanic ash and chemical signatures that tell the story of the climate, year by year, for hundreds of thousands of years. And in the layers corresponding to the time just after the last great ice age, they found something that shouldn't be there. A shock. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth was warming. The great ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Europe were in full retreat. Humanity, having survived the brutal cold, was on the move. Megafauna like the woolly mammoth still roamed the plains. The world was slowly healing. And then, without warning, the healing stopped. The climate didn't just cool down again, it plunged. This event is known as the Younger Dryas. It is not a theory. It is a measured, documented and undisputed fact of our planet's recent past. The Greenland ice cores show that in some regions, average temperatures plummeted by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, a catastrophic drop back to near glacial conditions. And the most terrifying part, this didn't happen over centuries. The data suggests the change was brutally fast, potentially taking hold in just a few decades. Imagine the climate of modern Scandinavia suddenly reverting to the depths of the Ice Age, all within a single human lifetime. The impact was global and devastating. Glaciers that had been retreating for millennia suddenly stopped and began to advance again. Forests died off, replaced by frozen tundra. The ecosystems that had supported giant mammals like the mastodon and the saber-toothed cat collapsed, leading to a wave of extinctions, and for the small bands of human hunter-gatherers, it was a profound crisis. The world they had just begun to understand was violently torn away from them. the dawn of agriculture, the first steps towards settled life. All of it was thrown into a 1,000-year-long winter. This is the real cataclysm. Not a wandering pole or a sliding crust, but a documented climate shock that slammed the brakes on the entire planet right at the moment our story as a civilized species was about to begin. The event is real. The timeline fits. The question is no longer if a catastrophe happened. The only question left is, what caused it? The mainstream scientific explanation is surprisingly elegant, but a more controversial theory points to a disaster that came from the sky. So, the ice cores tell a clear story. Around 12,900 years ago, the planet's climate system broke. A warm, wet, melting world was suddenly, violently, thrown back into the depths of the Ice Age. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is why. And here, our investigation finds itself at a fork in the road, with two very different stories about what could trigger a global catastrophe. The first path is the one followed by the vast majority of paleoclimatologists. It's a story not of fire from the sky, but of water. As the great ice sheets that covered North America were melting, they held back an enormous body of fresh water, a glacial lake larger than all of the Great Lakes combined. Geologists call it Lake Agassiz. The theory holds that at some point the ice dam holding back this colossal lake failed. A volume of water greater than all the world's rivers combined catastrophically flooded into the North Atlantic Ocean. Now this wasn't just a big flood, it was a planetary systems failure. Cold, fresh water is less dense than warm, salty water. This immense freshwater pulse didn't mix. It spread out across the surface of the ocean like a lid, effectively shutting down the great ocean current that carries warm tropical water north, the Atlantic's heat conveyor belt. The switch was flipped. The heat supply to the northern hemisphere was cut off, and the world plunged back into a deep freeze. This is the meltwater pulse hypothesis. It requires no exotic explanation, just the known physics of ice and water on a planetary scale. But there is a second path, a more dramatic, more controversial story that has captured the public imagination. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It argues that the trigger for the cold snap wasn't water from below, but fire from above. The theory proposes that a comet, or fragments of a comet, exploded in the atmosphere over the North American ice sheet. The resulting airburst would have been thousands of times more powerful than any nuclear weapon, igniting continent-spanning wildfires. The evidence, proponents claim, is a thin, dark layer of sediment, a __quote, _7, _ found at archaeological sites across North America, which supposedly contains markers of an extraterrestrial impact, microscopic diamonds, metallic spherules, and a telltale spike in the element platinum. It is a terrifyingly compelling narrative. It offers a single, cinematic event to explain the chaos of the Younger Dryas. But an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary proof, and this is where the impact hypothesis runs into serious problems. The first and most obvious is the crater. An impact large enough to alter the global climate should have left behind a monumental scar on the Earth's surface. And despite years of searching, no crater of the correct age has ever been found. The Hiawatha crater in Greenland was briefly considered a candidate, but subsequent dating showed it to be millions of years old. The second problem is replication. Science works by independent verification. One team makes a discovery, and other teams must be able to find the same evidence using the same methods. In the case of the Younger Dryas impact, this has largely failed to happen. Numerous independent studies have been unable to find the nanodiamonds, the magnetic spherules, and other impact markers in that black mat layer. The evidence, it seems, is stubbornly inconsistent. So while the debate continues in some circles, the scientific consensus is clear. The meltwater hypothesis remains the most robust evidence-based explanation for the Younger Dryas. The impact hypothesis, while dramatic, remains a fringe theory, lacking the definitive, verifiable evidence that science demands. The cataclysm was real, but its cause was likely terrestrial, a consequence of the planet's own complex machinery, not an invader from space. If an entire world could be extinguished in a flash of geological time, what would survive? Not buildings, not monuments, maybe not even bones. What survives is memory. And if that memory is profound enough, traumatic enough, it might not just survive. It might become a ghost story told by the entire human race. This is the next layer of our investigation. We leave the hard data of ice cores and geology and enter the world of myth. Because according to proponents of the lost civilization theory, the evidence for the cataclysm isn't just buried under the ice. It's buried in our oldest stories. Almost every culture on Earth has a story of a great flood, a world-destroying deluge sent to wipe the slate clean. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, a man warned by the gods to build a great ship to survive a flood that will destroy mankind. In the Hebrew Bible, the story is of Noah. In Hindu mythology, it's the story of Manu, saved from the waters by the god Vishnu in the form of a fish. The tale echoes through Greek myth, Norse sagas, and the legends of indigenous peoples in the Americas, Australia, and across the Pacific. The details change, but the architecture of the story remains eerily the same. A divine warning, a global cataclysm of water, a handful of human beings saved in a vessel, and the world born anew from a single point of survival. For theorists, this global pattern is too consistent to be a coincidence. They see it not as a collection of separate myths, but as the fragmented, worldwide echo of a single real event, the catastrophic end of the last ice age. But the flood is only half the story. The other, perhaps more important half, is about what happens after the waters recede. In these same mythologies, a strange figure often appears, a teacher, a lawgiver, a civilizing hero who brings the survivors the tools of a new life, agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and writing. In the Andes of South America, the legends speak of Viracocha. He was a bearded, pale-skinned teacher who appeared after the flood, wandering the land and teaching the sciences to a primitive humanity. In ancient Mesopotamia, the records tell of Awans, a mysterious being, part man, part fish, who emerged from the Persian Gulf each day to give humanity knowledge of laws, letters, and the arts. In Egypt, the oldest traditions speak of Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age when gods walked among humans and established the foundations of their civilization. Here, the theory makes its boldest and most compelling leap. It argues that these are not tales of gods or supernatural beings. They are distorted historical accounts. The flood was the Younger Dryas cataclysm, and the bearded teachers, the fishmen, the gods of the first time, they were the survivors, refugees from a highly advanced civilization that was destroyed by the cataclysm, a civilization supposedly based in a temperate Antarctica. They were not gods, but human beings, carrying the last embers of their world's knowledge, trying to replant the seeds of civilization among the scattered, traumatized hunter-gatherer tribes who had also survived. It's an intoxicating idea. It reframes our entire understanding of the past. It suggests our myths are not simple fables, but a kind of human fossil record, preserving the memory of a lost chapter of our own history. The pattern is tantalizing, a global web of stories that seem to tell the same tale. But does anthropology and mythology offer a different explanation for why so many cultures dreamed of a world washed clean by water? It's an incredibly powerful idea, a single, unifying trauma for all of humanity, a shared, primal memory of a world washed away, leaving only a handful of survivors to carry the story forward. It explains why a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, a priest in Egypt, and a shaman in the Andes might all tell a story with the same terrifying core. The water came for everyone. But what if the answer isn't a single event in the past, but a set of universal conditions that humanity has always faced? What if the myths aren't an echo of one great flood, but a chorus of voices from all over the world singing about many different floods? This is where the investigation leaves the realm of speculative history and enters the field of anthropology. And the explanation it offers is, in its own way, just as profound. First, there is the simple, brutal reality of where civilization began. Humans build societies near water. The great cradles of civilization, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, all grew on the fertile floodplains of massive rivers. These rivers were the source of life. They brought water for crops and rich silt that renewed the soil. But once every few generations, the life-giver would become a monster. A season of unusual rain or snowmelt upstream could turn the predictable annual flood into a churning, landscape-altering catastrophe that would erase towns and drown thousands. For the people who survived, it would have been, for all intents and purposes, the end of the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of our oldest written stories, describes its flood not as a global event but as a Mesopotamian one. It didn't need to be global to feel that way. But there was another much larger story unfolding, not over a season, but over millennia. As the great ice sheets of the last ice age melted, they released an unimaginable volume of water into the world's oceans. Over thousands of years, global sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet. That's roughly 120 meters. This wasn't a single, towering tsunami. It was something more insidious. A slow, relentless advance. A generation would lose a beach. Their children would lose the coastal forest. Their grandchildren would see the family's ancestral village become a new bay. For coastal peoples all over the planet, the world was, quite literally, drowning. Any civilization that lived on the continental shelves, which would have been prime real estate in the Ice Age, was slowly, inexorably wiped from the map, its cities and towns submerged. The memory of this slow-motion apocalypse, passed down through generations, would sound very much like a flood myth. Finally, there is the power of the flood as a symbol. Water cleanses. It destroys the old and allows for a new beginning. A great flood is the ultimate reset button for a society. It's a story of destruction, but also of purification and rebirth. It's a foundational archetype, a narrative shape so powerful that it's almost inevitable that cultures, facing their own local catastrophes, would pour their experiences into this same mythic container. A local river flood, a slow global rise in sea level, and the universal power of a story. Taken together, these three factors provide a powerful explanation for the flood myths of the world. An explanation that doesn't require a single global catastrophe or a lost civilization in Antarctica. It only requires the shared experience of being human, living at the edge of the water, and knowing that the water can always win. So, the ancient maps and myths, when examined closely, seem to tell a different story. A story not of a lost super race, but of human ingenuity, fear, and our enduring need to chart the unknown, both on our maps and in our minds. But the investigation didn't stop there. In the 20th century, the search for a hidden Antarctica moved from the library to the ice itself, fueled by new technology and old suspicions. The search for lost worlds has always been a story of physical exploration, of ships battling ice floes, of men trekking across frozen wastes, of digging through rock and sand. But in the late 20th century, the nature of exploration changed. The final frontier on Earth was not to be conquered by foot but by sight. From an altitude of hundreds of kilometers, the age of the satellite had begun, and with it, a new kind of explorer emerged. Not adventurers in parkas, but analysts, researchers, and ordinary curious people sifting through terabytes of publicly available data from NASA and Google Earth. They were looking for patterns the human eye, bound to the ground, could never see. And in the vast, monotonous white of Antarctica, they began to find things that didn't seem to belong. The first discoveries were startling in their simplicity. In the Ellsworth Mountains, one of the highest ranges on the continent, satellite photos revealed a peak that seemed unnervingly familiar. It was a stark black mountain of rock, punching through the ice sheet. But it was the mountain's shape that caused a global stir online. It appeared to be a near-perfect four-sided pyramid, its faces and ridges seemingly too symmetrical to be a product of natural erosion. Soon, others were found nearby. These weren't subtle anomalies. They looked to an untrained eye like the pyramids of Giza transplanted to the coldest place on Earth. The images went viral. For those who believed in a lost chapter of history, this was it. The smoking gun. Ancient maps were one thing, ambiguous and open to interpretation. But this was a photograph, a direct image of what looked like a massive artificial structure, exactly where a lost civilization might have built it. But the pyramids were just the beginning. Another, far larger and more mysterious feature was hiding in the data, invisible to any camera. It was discovered not by looking at the surface, but by measuring what lies beneath. Using satellites equipped to map Earth's gravitational field, scientists can detect subtle variations in mass deep within the planet. They can essentially weigh the rock under the ice, and in a region known as Wilkes Land, they found something enormous. It's a vast circular scar in the Earth's crust. Over 300 kilometers wide with an unusually dense mass, a mascon, at its center. This isn't a mountain or a valley. It's a ghost in the machine, a gravitational echo of a structure so immense it warps the very fabric of the local physics. This is the Wilkes Land anomaly. Unlike the pyramids, it offers no clean lines or familiar shapes, only a profound sense of scale and an unnerving question. What could possibly leave a footprint that large hidden under miles of ice? So what are these strange geometric shapes seen from space? Are they the tips of buried pyramids, evidence of a lost race of builders? The answer, according to geologists, is both simpler and in its own way more elegant. What the satellites are seeing are the peaks of mountains. They have a specific name, nunataks. A nunatak is essentially an island of rock in a vast sea of ice, a peak so high that it pierces through the ice sheet, exposing it to the sky. Thousands of them exist across Antarctica. But why the sharp, seemingly artificial shape? The answer isn't construction, but deconstruction. It's a process called frost wedging. Over countless seasons, small amounts of meltwater seep into cracks in the rock. At night, this water freezes and expands, acting like a tiny, powerful jack widening the crack. When this happens relentlessly, over millennia, on all sides of a mountain peak, it carves the rock away, flake by flake, creating the sharp arêtes and flat triangular faces that, from above, look uncannily like the sides of a pyramid. Nature, it turns out, is a patient and precise sculptor. This explanation, grounded in basic geology, accounts for the pyramidal mountains. But it doesn't address the other, far larger anomaly, that immense circular feature buried beneath the ice of Wilkes Land. This isn't something you can see with a camera. It was detected by satellites measuring minute changes in Earth's gravity. The data revealed a massive basin hundreds of kilometers across, with an unusually dense concentration of mass, a mascon, at its center. To be clear, something enormous is down there. The leading scientific hypothesis, first proposed in the 1960s and supported by modern data, is that the Wilkes Land anomaly is the scar of a colossal impact. A crater, perhaps over 300 miles in diameter, left by an asteroid or comet that struck the Earth long before the ice arrived. How long before? The estimates are staggering. The impact may have occurred over 250 million years ago, potentially triggering the Permian-Triassic extinction event, the single greatest cataclysm in the history of complex life. An event that wiped out over 90% of all species on the planet. This is the central paradox of our investigation. The search for a lost human civilization leads us to evidence of something far older and far more powerful. We look for the ghosts of kings and architects, and instead we find the shadow of a world-ending impact. The reality under the ice might not be a human story, but a planetary one. It's arguably more awe-inspiring than any myth. So, the physical evidence points to natural geology. Grand, dramatic, but natural. For some, however, this is not the end of the story. For those convinced there is a secret to be found, this very lack of a smoking gun is itself a kind of evidence. The investigation simply mutates. It shifts from a search for ruins to a hunt for the people who are allegedly hiding them. So, if the anomalies seen from space are simply tricks of light and geology, the investigation seems to be at a standstill, the maps, the myths. The mountains, each trail has grown cold, and yet the feeling persists that something is being deliberately hidden. To find the source of that feeling, we must leave the satellite age and travel back in time, to the chaotic, paranoid years immediately following the Second World War. In 1946, with the world still clearing the rubble of a global conflict, the United States Navy quietly assembled the largest military force ever sent to Antarctica. It was called Operation Highjump. The fleet was staggering. An aircraft carrier, destroyers, submarines, icebreakers, and more than 4,700 men. Officially, its purpose was scientific, to test equipment and train personnel in extreme cold, and to establish an American research base called Little America 4. But the scale of the operation, for many, felt excessive. Was all this firepower really necessary just for mapping coastlines and studying penguins? This is where the official history ends. And a parallel, far stranger story begins, a story whispered in fringe circles for decades. It claims that Operation Highjump was not a scientific mission at all, it was a cover for a secret war. The theory goes that in 1938, just before the outbreak of war, a Nazi expedition had laid claim to a vast section of Antarctica, naming it New Swabia. And somewhere in that frozen territory, they had allegedly built a secret, highly advanced base, Base 211. A last redoubt, a refuge for the Nazi elite and their most secret technology. According to this narrative, the true objective of Operation Highjump was to find and destroy this Nazi holdout. The legend then takes an even more dramatic turn. It claims that the American forces were met not by soldiers in trenches, but by something else entirely. Advanced, circular flying craft, quote, 9, that emerged from the ice and the sea, engaging the Navy's planes with incredible speed and maneuverability. The stories claim the encounters were disastrous for the American task force, forcing a premature and humiliating retreat. The mission, scheduled for 6 to 8 months, was abruptly terminated after just 8 weeks. Upon his return, the commander, Admiral Richard E. Byrd, was supposedly debriefed in secret. Proponents of the theory point to a single, unverified interview he allegedly gave to a Chilean newspaper, in which he is said to have warned that the United States must prepare to defend against enemy fighters that can quote, _10 ___. It's a story of a hidden war at the bottom of the world against a technologically superior foe that escaped the fall of Berlin. A secret war in the Antarctic against a technologically advanced remnant of the Third Reich. It's a story worthy of a blockbuster film. But what do the declassified military records and historical documents say was the real purpose of the largest Antarctic expedition in history? So what really happened during Operation Highjump? Was it a secret war against a hidden enemy? To find the answer, we don't need to look at tabloid headlines or listen to whispers on the internet. We just need to look at the date, 1946. The Second World War was over, but a new, colder, and in many ways stranger conflict was just beginning. The declassified archives of the US Navy tell a story that is less about ancient civilizations and more about a very new, very human fear. The world of 1946 was a world being redrawn. The alliance with the Soviet Union had fractured, and the lines of a new global struggle were being sketched out. And the most terrifying new front in this Cold War wasn't in Europe or Asia. It was over the top of the world. Military strategists realized that the shortest path for a potential Soviet bomber attack on the United States was not across the Atlantic or Pacific, but over the North Pole. Suddenly, polar warfare was no longer a niche curiosity. It was a strategic necessity. The problem was the United States military had almost no experience operating in extreme cold. Could their ships withstand the pressure of pack ice? Could engines start in temperatures that would freeze fuel? Could soldiers survive, let alone fight, in a landscape that was actively trying to kill them? This is the real context of Operation Highjump. It wasn't an invasion. It was, according to its own documents, a massive training exercise. It was a dress rehearsal for World War III staged in the Antarctic, because the Arctic was too politically sensitive, too close to Soviet territory. The mission's primary, documented goals were to train personnel and test equipment, from aircraft carriers to submarines to winter clothing, in the most unforgiving environment on Earth. Beyond that, it had other clear objectives. In an age before satellites, maps were a strategic asset. Highjump was tasked with conducting the largest aerial mapping project in history, photographing millions of square miles of unknown territory. And there was a quieter political goal, to reinforce American territorial claims on the continent, a kind of geopolitical flag planting in the face of competing claims from Britain, Norway and Chile. The operation was a logistical behemoth, and by all accounts somewhat chaotic. It was planned in a hurry and faced brutal, as unexpected weather. The mission was cut short not by a battle with mysterious flying discs, but by the approaching Antarctic winter and a series of accidents, including a plane crash that killed 3 men. Admiral Byrd's dramatic comments to a Chilean newspaper upon his return about a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds were likely a combination of an explorer's flair for the dramatic and the genuine, widespread anxiety of the dawning atomic age. It was a warning about the new reality of potential Soviet aggression, not a confession about a secret war. In the end, Operation Highjump was not an expedition to cover up the past. It was a deeply paranoid, ambitious, and sprawling first move to prepare for a terrifying future. But this is where the story gets strange again. If Antarctica was so strategically vital, the next move in this great game should have been to build more bases, to militarize the continent, to turn it into a frozen fortress. Instead, just over a decade later, the superpowers did something that seemed to defy all logic. They sat down together and signed a treaty that effectively sealed the continent off from any military activity, forever. For the theorists, this wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the ultimate proof of the cover-up. The official story of Operation Highjump ends with an early withdrawal and a mountain of new maps. The unofficial story ends with Admiral Byrd's supposed warnings of a new enemy. But both stories lead to the same, deeply strange event that happens just over a decade later, an event that, for many researchers, is the single most compelling piece of evidence that something was found in the ice. The year is 1959. The Cold War is at its absolute peak. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a global struggle, a zero-sum game of nuclear brinkmanship, espionage, and proxy wars. The world is cleanly, brutally divided into two camps, and the assumption is that any agreement on any topic is impossible. And yet in Washington, D.C., on December 1st, 1959, something unprecedented happens. The 12 nations most active on the southern continent, including the United States and the Soviet Union, sign a document, the Antarctic Treaty. At the height of their mutual hostility, the two superpowers who could not agree on the status of Berlin or the future of Korea quietly agreed on the future of an entire continent. They declared it a land of peace and science, a place where military activity was banned and territorial claims were frozen indefinitely. For proponents of the lost civilization theory, this is not a footnote of diplomatic history. This is the smoking gun. They ask a simple, powerful question. Why? Why would the two most paranoid and antagonistic empires on Earth create a sanctuary out of the world's most resource-rich and strategically positioned continent? Why would they voluntarily give up the ultimate high ground? There is, from this perspective, only one logical, if terrifying, explanation. They found something so important, so paradigm-shattering, that the Cold War itself suddenly seemed like a secondary problem. The logic is inescapable. What could possibly unite mortal enemies, except a discovery that threatens them both, or a secret that makes their conflict obsolete? In this light, the Antarctic Treaty is not a document of peace. It is a pact of silence. Every article is reinterpreted not as a noble ideal, but as a mechanism of control. A ban on military bases isn't about preventing war. It's about preventing independent military reconnaissance. Dedicating the continent to science isn't about pure research. It's about controlling who gets to do the research and what they're allowed to report. The moratorium on mining and resource extraction isn't about environmental protection. It's about preventing private corporations from accidentally drilling into a ruin that's 2 miles down. From this viewpoint, the treaty is the most successful and long-lasting cover-up in human history. A global agreement to declare the world's greatest potential archaeological site a permanent off-limits scientific preserve, a locked room the size of a continent, with the world's superpowers acting as the guards. But is that what the treaty really is? An unprecedented conspiracy of silence, or something else entirely? The answer, as it turns out, is hidden in the text of the treaty itself, in one specific article that is the precise opposite of a cover-up. So, what if the conspiracy theorists are right? What if the most powerful nations on Earth, at the height of the Cold War, secretly agreed to lock away an entire continent? To find the answer, we don't need to speculate, we just need to read the document itself. The story of the Antarctic Treaty doesn't begin with a secret meeting, but with a global scientific celebration. Between 1957 and 1958, 67 nations participated in the International Geophysical Year, or IGY. It was an unprecedented 18-month period of coordinated research into the Earth's properties. In Antarctica, scientists from 12 countries, including the US and the Soviet Union, set aside their political differences and worked together, sharing data and resources in the pursuit of knowledge. It was a stunning success. But as the IGY drew to a close, a dangerous question emerged. What happens next? 7 nations had already laid claim to slices of Antarctica, often overlapping. The US and the USSR recognized none of these claims but reserved the right to make their own. The continent was a geopolitical time bomb. In the logic of the Cold War, it was destined to become a military staging ground, a site for nuclear testing, the world's coldest battlefield. And this is where the story takes a truly unexpected turn. Instead of partitioning the continent, those 12 nations, the same ones who had cooperated during the IGY, met in Washington. And in 1959, they did something almost unheard of in human history. They agreed to press pause on their territorial claims. They agreed to ban all military activity, all weapons testing, and all nuclear explosions from the entire continent forever. They declared that Antarctica would be used for peaceful purposes only, a natural reserve devoted to science. But the most radical part of the treaty, the clause that directly confronts the idea of a massive cover-up, is hidden in its text. It's called Article 7. It gives all signatory nations the absolute right to inspect any and all installations on the continent at any time, any station, any building, any piece of equipment, even any ship or aircraft at points of discharging or embarking cargo or personnel. To put it simply, if the United States suspected the Soviets were building a secret base, they had the legal right to show up and look around, and vice versa. This isn't a lock on a door. It's a mandatory open-door policy, written into international law at the height of global paranoia. So the grand conspiracy dissolves under examination. What looked like a secret agreement to hide something was, in reality, one of the most transparent and optimistic treaties ever signed. It wasn't a cover-up. It was a choice to protect the last pristine place on Earth from the worst of our instincts. But this doesn't mean Antarctica has no secrets. It is home to a hidden world, more ancient and alien than any imagined civilization, a world sealed in darkness for 15 million years. This entire investigation has been a search for something hidden, a lost civilization, a secret base, a conspiracy. But the theories were all looking for the wrong thing. They were looking for a human story, a mirror of our own world buried in the ice. The truth, it turns out, is far stranger, and in many ways far more profound. Because there is a lost world in Antarctica. It just isn't ours. For decades, Russian scientists at the Vostok Station, the coldest inhabited place on Earth, noticed a strange anomaly. Their radar, designed to measure the thickness of the ice, kept showing a massive, perfectly flat area deep beneath them, a ghost on the screen. It was too large to be an error. After years of mapping, the truth became undeniable. Under 4 kilometres, or 2.5 miles of solid ice, there was a lake. A body of liquid water the size of Lake Ontario, held in eternal darkness by the crushing weight of an entire continent. It is called Lake Vostok. This place shouldn't exist. The water is kept liquid by the immense pressure from the ice above and the faint geothermal heat from the earth below. But the most important fact about Lake Vostok isn't its size or its depth, it's its isolation. Scientific analysis of the ice layers above it confirms that the lake has been completely sealed off from the Earth's atmosphere, from sunlight, from any contact with the outside world, for at least 15 million years. Not thousands, millions. What could possibly survive in a place like that? A world without light, under pressure that would crush a submarine, in water supersaturated with oxygen. For years, scientists debated whether the lake was sterile, a pristine dead relic of a bygone age. To find out, they undertook one of the most ambitious drilling projects in history, carefully boring through miles of ancient ice. They stopped just short of the liquid water itself, to avoid contaminating an ecosystem that had been alone for longer than humanity has existed. Instead, they analysed the ice at the very bottom of the drill core. This wasn't glacial ice, this was accretion ice, water from the lake that had frozen onto the bottom of the ice sheet, and inside that frozen water they found the answer. They didn't find ruins, they didn't find artifacts, they found life. The DNA analysis, first published around 2013, was staggering. Researchers identified thousands of unique gene sequences. The vast majority belonged to bacteria, but there were also fungi and even traces of more complex organisms. It was a complete self-contained biosphere, an ecosystem that had evolved in total isolation for millions of years, powered not by the sun, but by the chemical energy from the rocks at the bottom of the lake. We went looking for a lost civilization and found a lost planet hidden beneath our own, a world that proves that life is more stubborn, more alien, and more resilient than we could have possibly imagined. This isn't a theory. It's a verified biological wonder, a genuine hidden world of life, preserved in time, and as it turns out, the entire continent is a time capsule. Another recent discovery has given us a perfect snapshot of that world, before the ice came to claim it. The single, isolated ecosystem of Lake Vostok is a message in a bottle, a biological ghost story of a world that existed millions of years ago. But what if there's more than a bottle? What if, beneath the ice, there is an entire library, a perfectly preserved map of that lost world? As it turns out, there is. In late 2023, scientists announced a discovery that, in any other context, would have been global front-page news. Using satellite data and ice-penetrating radar, a team of researchers mapped a vast landscape hidden beneath more than 2 kilometers of ice in East Antarctica. It wasn't a city. It was something far older and far more significant. What they found was a world frozen in time. A snapshot of a complete river system, with valleys carved by ancient water flows and highlands that once separated them. A landscape the size of Belgium, perfectly preserved, untouched by erosion for an unimaginable length of time. This isn't a theory or a computer model. It is a direct image of what Antarctica looked like just before the ice came, and the age of this landscape? According to the research team, it is at least 34 million years old. It is a ghost of the Eocene epoch, the last moment before the Great Freezing began, before the planet's climate tipped over and the ice sheet began its slow, inexorable advance. It is a pristine record of the very world we spoke of at the beginning of this investigation. Here, then, is the ultimate irony of our search. Antarctica is a time capsule. It does hold the secrets of a lost world, but it's not our world. The story it tells is not about human history, but about planetary history. The rivers that carved those ancient valleys flowed tens of millions of years before the first human ancestor stood upright. The forests that grew on their banks were silent of any human voice. The civilization that the ice preserves is not one of stone and metal, but one of geology and biology, of ancient climates and the slow, powerful forces that shape a planet. The ice does not hide our past. It hides the Earth's past, and in doing so, it holds up a mirror to the very limits of our own story, showing us how brief, how recent, and how fragile our existence truly is. So, after all this, we are left with a paradox. The evidence for a lost human civilization in Antarctica evaporates under scrutiny. The maps are misread. The theories of cataclysm are built on shaky ground. The conspiracies are born from the fog of the Cold War, and yet the story refuses to die. It thrives on the internet, in books, in our own imagination. Why? The answer, it seems, has less to do with the ice, and more to do with ourselves. So, our investigation has reached a strange and beautiful dead end. The artifacts have dissolved into misinterpretations. The conspiracies have evaporated into the mundane realities of the Cold War. And the hidden worlds we did find are far older, far stranger, and far less human than the one we were looking for. The case, by all rational measures, is closed. And yet, the story will not die. Why? If the evidence isn't there, why does the idea of a lost Antarctic civilization feel so necessary? This is where the investigation must turn inward, because the story isn't really about a continent of ice. It's about a continent of the mind. Antarctica, as the last true blank space on our planet, has become a mirror, and what we see in it, reflected in the endless white, is ourselves, our deepest fears and our most persistent hopes. Remember the maps of the Renaissance? The concept of horror vacui, the fear of empty space, the same psychological impulse that drove a 16th century cartographer to fill a terrifying southern ocean with an imaginary continent, is the same impulse that drives us today to fill a silent, deep past with an imaginary golden age. The technology has changed, from ink and parchment to satellite images and internet forums, but the human need to fill the void remains exactly the same. We cannot stand the silence of deep time. We cannot accept that a vast piece of our world and a vast piece of our history could simply be empty. Look closer at what the mirror shows. First, it reflects our anxiety. The story of a civilization of unimaginable sophistication wiped out in a single catastrophic event is a story we tell ourselves for a reason. It is a dress rehearsal for our own deepest fears. In the flash-frozen cities of a mythical Antarctica, we process our very real anxieties about climate change, about nuclear war, about a global pandemic, about any of the 1,000 fragile threads that hold our own world together. We tell the story of their sudden end to manage our fear of our own. But the mirror reflects more than just fear. It also shows us a profound, almost heartbreaking hope. The idea that we are not the pinnacle of history, but are instead amnesiac survivors of something far greater. a hope that humanity was once wiser, more in tune with the cosmos, capable of feats we can no longer imagine. In a world that often feels chaotic, disillusioning and mundane, this story offers a sense of lost nobility. It whispers that our potential is not limited to what we see around us, but is anchored in a forgotten, grander past. We are not just what we are the shadow of what we once were. This is why the myth of Antarctica endures. It is the perfect screen for these projections. It's a real place we can point to on a globe, but it is conceptually empty, a locked room at the bottom of the world. And what we imagine is inside that room tells us everything we need to know, not about ancient astronauts or Atlantean refugees, but about the hopes and fears of the people staring at the door. And so, the investigation ends where it began, in a landscape of white silence, a continent that holds our past, the 34-million-year-old rivers, the 15-million-year-old life in its dark lakes, but not our history. The search for a lost civilization in Antarctica is not, in the end, a search for evidence. The evidence has consistently pointed in another direction. It's a search for something else, a search for meaning. 500 years ago, cartographers looked at the empty space at the bottom of the world and filled it with a phantom continent, Terra Australis Incognita. They did this because an unbalanced world, an incomplete map, felt wrong. It was an act of imagination to impose order on the unknown. Today, we're still drawing that same map. We look at the empty space in our deep past, that vast, silent era before recorded history, and we fill it with a phantom civilization. A noble, wise, and tragic people who held the secrets of the cosmos, only to be erased by a global fire or a world-drowning flood. We do this for the exact same reason the old map makers did. Because an empty past, a history that begins so recently and so humbly, feels incomplete. It feels wrong. The story of a lost Antarctic world may not be a true history of humanity, but it is a perfect history of the human imagination. It is the story we tell ourselves to feel less small in the face of geological time, a story to feel less fragile in the face of the cosmos. It's a story that whispers that we are older and grander than the records show. That even if our own world were to vanish tomorrow, some essential part of us, some warning, some piece of knowledge, some memory, might survive. This is why the story will never die. It isn't a theory to be proven or disproven with ice cores and satellite data. It is a modern myth, and like all powerful myths, it isn't about what happened in the past. It's about what we fear and what we hope for right now. The final mystery, then, is not what lies buried 2 miles beneath the Antarctic ice. The final mystery is why we feel such a profound, unshakable need to look. It is a journey to the most alien place on Earth, in search of the most human thing imaginable, a reflection of ourselves.